Thank you, Cameron. Do we have any questions before we sum up? Do you have the representative of the Estonia and Netherlands were I only say making a lot of notes. I can disclose this, of course. Do you have any questions, some specific, or that pop out your mind that you want to address to our speakers?
So first of all, thank you very much for your insights. I think it's been very useful, and I can also pass this on to my colleagues who work on migration. And I think it's very interesting what you said about trends in, for example, US, also appearing in Europe. And I think we also say in the Netherlands, well, if something happens in the US, then in 2 years we'll see it here as well. And maybe also interesting to know that our previous government now, the parliament is Poland, or cabinet is Poland, will have elections actually this month. They also try to make emergency migration laws. And our highest court said, well, it's not a crisis, so you cannot do this. And this was like the whole issue that actually led to the fall of the current government. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering, because I think in many EU countries right now, there's just so much debate around migration, and migrants are seen more as a problem. And we're not actually talking about migration and rights of migrants. We're talking more about migration as this problem because we see the pressure on infrastructure, and people feel like they have it worse than previous generations. And I was wondering, what do you think we could do to shift this public discourse to a more constructive debate and actually talk more about the issues? And do you see a role for OSCE in this?
Mm-hmm. So to generalize your question, because it will you further away. So the question, as I understand it, now before, well, Clara was saying we had like refugee welcome, and now we have like we have a migration crisis. So we have like we shifted to from one extreme to another extreme, and there is a gap of practical, what we are saying, the practical measures. Like I was emphasizing, measures on the Polish-Belarusian border, practical, that we can manage this. Also, Clara was saying that we are looking into European migrants, but maybe we should look in the zones that they're causing this, the real refugees. They are the problematic. And what Cameron was saying, that what I understand it, that there's a problem with ideology and also awareness and kind of mindset of our national states. So we have different ways. And you asking how we can, as I understand it, balance this narration between those extremes. Yes, what we can do and what we can use for use OSCE, because OSCE is one, like you said it, or one of the organization. That involves the United States and Europe, so we can have the platform to work on it, and with the High Commission. So maybe, Cameron, could you have some?
Sure. Yeah, so it's a good question. The first thing I would say that must be done is we have to reframe what the issue is all about. And that means, as far as I understand it, this is really not an immigration crisis anymore. It began as such. And as I suggested in my summary, in my remarks, I think this was a crisis that was manufactured. It was a crisis that was invited upon us because of an ideological commitment to, as I said, pluralism, right? What started as an ideology and became a crisis of immigration is now a crisis of democracy and identity. That's what this is really about. Number one. Number two, I would also emphasize that there is an assertion that this crisis is solely about people coming from war-torn countries like Palestinians in Gaza, for example, or Arabs in Syria migrating into Western countries. So moving from poor countries into rich countries. But there is another form of this crisis. It is called geo-arbitrage. And these are wealthy people coming primarily from the West, but not exclusively from the West, that are moving into poorer countries. So, for example, you may not know, but in Portugal has gone to great measures to make it easier for entrepreneurs, particularly from the United States, to come into Portugal, where they have bought Airbnbs, they have bought up whole apartment complexes, and ostensibly, what the Portuguese government was hoping is that this would create a wealth effect, that this would bring in new jobs, that this would create ecosystems, that this would retrain the Portuguese population. Some of that may be going on, but guess what? Now there's a housing crisis in cities like Lisbon, and there's gentrification because the local population, whose country and city it actually is, are being forced out of their homes because rents are too high. They can't afford to live in their own cities. And instead, who's living there? Brits and Americans and Germans and other peoples, because for them, it's less expensive. Geo arbitrage. This is all part of the same crisis. So it's not just about poor people or refugees or asylum seekers necessarily who are seeking refuge in the West. It's also about rich people in some cases, or wealthier people. In some cases, they're not rich or wealthy. They're just coming from wealthier countries where they can't afford to live. And so they are practicing this thing called geo arbitrage. And then thirdly, and this is what Clara talked about, there has been a massive abuse of the system. There has been an exploitation and a repurposing of vehicles of democracy, or at least purportedly for democracy, against the very populations they were created to serve. Again, this is a crisis of democracy, is a crisis of national identity. So we have to reframe, number one. Number two, we have to recognize the complexities involved in this. And number three, we have to use our imagination to understand that the letter of the law is different than the spirit of the law. And I would submit to you that, yeah, maybe a lot of these folks have legal rights by the letter of the law. But if that is true and it violates the rights of the sovereign people, then it's breaking the spirit of the law. And that's the way we need to talk about it.
I think, for your question, that real diagnosis, we need a real diagnosis, we need a real discussion. And it looks like it is not allowed to happen because we have a real gap between European politicians and citizens in European Union. Because as you mentioned, we talk about problems, why we don't focus on, let's say, solutions, or at least, how to resolve these problems. But it is like we are not allowed, because from the European Parliament, all this law that we have, it is written like from a side of migration, for good, for profit, for these people. It is just written. But what we see underneath, we need to organize our life. So if we, for example, if we have this, as you said, abusement of this system, the instrumentalization of these procedures, of migration procedures by so-called refugees, and these are clients of smugglers, human traffic. So the countries also in Poland, but Balkan states and so on, we need to deal with this problem. Okay, so we are like making free passage to Germany. We don't see these people, but it is against the law. In fact, it is against the law. It is our law from European Union. So we have like two realities. One is like official, and then we need to solve the problem on the ground. So it is what we really lack. This is real diagnosis for the situation.
Do you want to have a question?
Yes. Thank you also so much for the very interesting discussion and the insights. I would maybe ask. I was in Berlin last year when the German officials said during a meeting that Germany would need 400,000 new people each year on the labor market to maintain their economy. So I would maybe ask, do you think that in 2015
when Germany and Angela Merkel were praised as these humanitarian heroes for opening their borders and letting the people in. Uh, how much do you think was due to economic reasons, and how much was the humanitarian cause?
So the question was, I think you emphasized also a bit in the lecture how the EU policies, I can think sum it up, are and also the policy in 2015 about Angela Merkel, how it was the cause of this openness was the labor market, and what is the helping the Syrians. Because the representative of Estonia said that now they saying Germans saying that they need 400,000 new cheap labor force to ensure that the German economy would run.
We need to decide. Because if you want to help people, it is humanitarian assistance. It's humanitarian assistance, okay? And if we need, we need for cheap labor people, to come to work for us. We need to use this clear language. If we want them to to work for us in all these cheap jobs, with low payments. So we need to say it, and we need to be honest with this problem, because to be honest, I don't know, now if it's very if about the economics of Germany. I don't know how if they need these people or not in reality.
And we don't know how those people are really working after they're coming and not using the social welfare system. I was living in Norway, for instance, and we had the whole social welfare system was interconnected and overcome by the migrant population from the Middle East. And they were even the clerks in the NAF, the Norwegian social system, was run by those, and they create a system of financing those populations, and they were not contributing to the national economies. So it's also a question: do they need it? Of course, like Clara said, that we should speak frankly. Yes, come to work, and it's so different. Not
come to work, and this
yes.
It's not.
And I think it's using these migrants that are coming from crises because they're forced, that they don't have any option.
Exactly.
So
yes.
And they need help, and not to be used as a cheap labor that don't have any opportunity. It's forced by the situation to do the worst.
Asylum policy is something different than migration policy.
Yes.
So
we must diversify.
Yes.
Yes. So this is a very important question. This might be the most important question that we address, actually. So what I'm going to do is just read a brief excerpt from an article that you should get. I can provide it to you if you want. It's called "The Economic Case for Mass Migration is Collapsing." It was written by an Englishman named Matthew Goodwin. And this is about the situation in the United Kingdom, but I will speak more broadly about the economies in the West, because it is a red herring. It is, I think, a flat lie that we depend on mass migration, that we depend on cheap labor, or that it has actually benefited us. And there's various metrics I can use to substantiate my claim. Matt Goodwin says, the Office for Budget Responsibility, the OBR, quietly notes that mass immigration is contributing to what is known as capital dilution, or what I call the population trap. This is what happens when populations expand so quickly that the sheer scale and speed of this population change exceeds the capacity of the state to provide its own citizens with functioning public services, such as a functioning national health service and education system, as well as things like affordable and available housing and safe neighborhoods. Mass immigration, in short, is managed decline because it puts enormous pressure on a state that is already struggling to provide public services for its existing population. Now, this speaks to the term that Clara used, which is diagnosis, a fundamental unearthing of the facts. Obviously, when you bring large numbers of people into your country, and we're talking millions, there are infrastructure challenges, right? You have to provide education, you have to provide healthcare, et cetera, especially for people that are coming from other countries that don't have the familial networks, the community relationships that defray a lot of that cost away from the state, okay? So that's the first thing. The second thing is that we have been promised, not just in the United States, but across Europe. And as I suggested earlier, I don't think it's an overstatement to say, and I think you intimated the same, that much of what happens in Europe tends to be based on a template in the United States. This is for ill, I would argue, especially over the last 50 years on this particular issue. It has been argued that because we have a death rate that's rising higher than a birth rate, that we will collapse economically, maybe socially, if we do not import large numbers of people, in particular because of public indebtedness. Well, since the mass immigration, as I said, I think the number is 75 to 100 million people in the United States, our public indebtedness has skyrocketed. Our actual GDP per capita has flattened, if not regressed. So has this deluge, has this mass influx of people actually stimulated economic growth? No, it hasn't done so at all. In fact, what it's done is it's added burden to the economic fiscal strain that a lot of these countries were bearing before these people showed up to begin with, okay? So it's actually been a net loss, a net burden economically. Now, those are numbers that we can see, that we can quantify. What about the sense of social isolation, of insecurity, or the resentment that the native-born population feels because it doesn't feel properly represented by its government? Because instead of getting a starter job at a local cafe, that goes not to a Polish teenager, but it goes to a Ukrainian. And maybe that Ukrainian needs that job. Where's the trade-off? Well, that trade-off is pretty clear. That's a net loss for Poland. It's not a net gain, right? And it is very much a zero-sum game in that sense when resources are scarce. That's easier to quantify, but the sense of resentment, the cultural stigma, the parallel societies, that is a social earthquake. And that's what you're beginning to see erupt across the West. Now you see violence, you see ethnic conflict that hasn't been seen in England in centuries. They haven't had political violence in over 100 years in that country, more or less. Now they do. Now it's quite common, and we're experiencing the same in the United States because of the boiling point that we've reached. So this is a talking point that's been used. One other thing I'll say about this is that a lot of the corporate elite, particularly the corporate elite in the United States, are beholden to the view that we depend, in this case, not necessarily on cheap labor, but on cheap white-collar labor, right? So these are H-1Bs, as we call them in the United States. These are people that supposedly have technical skills that are in deficit in the United States and in other Western countries. This is also a farce. This is part of a broader conspiracy, I would say, to maximize shareholder value, to enrich the corporate overlords at the expense, in many cases, of their own labor force, right? Who are not being paid what they should be paid. And as a result, wages go down, and your ability as an American, as a Pole, as a German to actually afford a first world standard of living, that evaporates. This is the consequence of mass immigration. This is the consequence of having a refugee or an asylum system that has been abused, that's been weaponized against the populations that it's supposed to serve.
Just one word, because Cameron mentioned demography. It is also demography. This is the reason why we need people from Africa and from the Middle East. Okay, but I think really to pose a very simple question, it is important to like focus this discussion on not this discussion, but in Europe, in European Union, on the Western world, to very simple but basic problems. Do we want, let's say in Poland, Estonia, Netherlands, do we want, because also we are aging and we are like less and less in Europe, European people. So maybe we will vanish. Yeah. So what we want? Do we want to be in Europe, replaced more and more people, or we want to be in Poland, Poles, Estonians, and so on and so on. So does demography does it have nationality or not? This is the question.
Yes. Yeah, and that speaks to what I said earlier, right? Democracy against pluralism against democracy, right? In the United States, we have reinvented ourselves as a nation of immigrants. Well, what is an immigrant? Who is that? What does that mean? And what does that say about the legacy populations, right? Again, what is a nation? Is it just some slab of land? Another thing too is that much work has gone into exploring reasons why populations in the Western world are shrinking instead of growing. And part of the reason for that is that economically we're not growing, particularly young men. What makes young men attractive to women and enables them to create a home and have a family and so forth is economic wealth. And over the last 30 or 40 years, because of open borders, because I would say, I would use the term financialization, the banking sector growing very large at the expense of the industrial sector. This is really what's happening in Germany. They're experiencing deindustrialization. The male populations in particular have gotten poor, and they're not attractive marital partners on that basis, which means they can't form families, which means they can't have children. And so this creates a feedback loop. One other comment on this is that if you do look at a broad sweep of history, you'll notice that there are booms and busts when it comes to fertility. It's a cyclical effect. There's absolutely no evidence that you can solve that problem by adding foreign peoples, right? By bringing in non-Poles or non-Germans. There's no evidence that will solve that problem.
Okay, do you have any more remarks, or
So, what would be the answer?
what would be the answer? What would be the solutions? What would be the recommendations? Let's finish with some recommendations to maybe the OSCE High Commissioner that may be gonna watch this video. So my practical recommendation about the practical, not like in the Cameron and Clara is saying in the big picture, but in the small picture regarding the crisis that we are still having on the Polish border. So this is practical things. Is to monitor and report on compliance with international and regional human rights standards concerning asylum, access to Polish-Belarusian border. I'm urging the Polish government to guarantee immediate and lawful registration for all asylum claims at the border crossings in the line of the Geneva Convention, the EU law. So basically to withdraw with this law that is sustain the asylum procedure application. Facilitate cooperation with the Europol and other agencies to dismantle transnational smuggling networks operating in Belarus and Poland. Ensure humanitarian access to border zones by international and civic organizations. And OSCE, I think, you should play a role regarding border monitoring. And promote training and oversight mechanisms to border officials to prevent refoulement and collective. So this is what we need to do for the real refugees, I think so, because like you said from the Netherlands that before, now we have the narration migration is we must cancel all migration basically. In Poland we have this kind of the narrative that from the one way now we are closing the border, and you don't give the solutions, practical legal solutions. Also with the border guards, for instance the centers for asylum seekers, they're open. They should, we think they should be closed for those who are asylum seekers, not to to cut this situation that they're gonna come to the open facility and then go to Germany. It should be closed. If you come to Poland and you want to seek asylum, you must stay, and there should be law and facilities for the border guards to facilitate this. And so I'm thinking that from my perspective, we should secure our border, but we can't change the humanitarian policies because it's part of our also national identity. Europe and United States of course, on one hand, like Cameron is saying that is going too much, the migration is going too much, but it's also our Christian heritage that we're different. You don't have this kind of policies in different regions. So I think we should stand our borders, state our strict policies, but also help the migrants. So this would be for the higher commission office of OSCE recommendations.
To be frank, I will say something very unprofessional because I don't know what to do. I think the most important thing is a real diagnosis of the situation we are being now, and then we can plan for the future, which directions we would like to follow. But the problem is we will not agree on this. So as Michał said, for example, these centers for migrants, they should be closed. I think for asylum seekers. Maybe they should be closed, but we have a lot of NGOs in Poland, they will oppose it because they say it is like prison. People will be kept in prison, so it cannot be closed. And so we will not agree. I don't know what to do. I think a real diagnosis is very needed, and we need to leave aside political correctness. But is it possible? This is the question.
Yes. So on this particular question, I am Pollyannish. I think the solution is in progress. I think we are solving these problems. The first is public awareness and diagnosis. So in the United States, we are actively now beginning to investigate organizations like USAID, right? And again, if you're operating under the umbrella of a nonprofit or an NGO or something of that nature, you've had carte blanche to do all kinds of things. Well, that's changing now. People are asking hard questions, and we have an entirely new cottage industry of independent journalists, the likes of which we haven't had before. In the United States, we have, I would say, people that have larger audiences than mainstream media, who are asking very hard questions about exactly what a lot of these governmental organizations are doing. Who's paying them? Where are the financial networks coming from that are financing them? That's a big part of this as well, right? You have organizations in the United States, for example, and in Europe called Open Society, right? Open Society is at the heart of everything that's happening. If I were to go into major cities in the United States, even here in Europe, a lot of people know about Open Society now. That was not the case 10 years ago. It was some obscure nonprofit that people didn't know much about. So public awareness, independent journalism, investigation, diagnosis, that's happening. And that's beginning to achieve scalability and virality. That's step one. That's in progress. The second is political reorganization. As I said at the beginning, the principal crisis here is not one of immigration. It's not about asylum seekers. This is now about the gap between the EU and the European populations themselves. It is about the gap between what happens in government and what happens at the street level. And what that's beginning to create is a political reorganization of the country. Of all of these nations. That means new political organizations are emerging, new leaders are emerging, new parties are emerging. I would say if you look at countries like the United Kingdom, for example, even in France, there is a groundswell now of awareness and resistance to the current structure of government. There's actually open talk in France, for example, that the Fifth Republic, which has governed France since 1958, may be over. And it probably is. For the reasons that we've discussed here. So the second is a political reorganization. And the third is going to be some mass form of remigration. That will have to be practically organized. There will be steps that we have to take ahead of that process. But listen, ladies and gentlemen, that's going to happen too. I'll tell you why. Because we have scarce resources. And people in nations are real things. And when times get tough, they come together. In fact, my young Polish colleague back there shared this with me, which I thought was noteworthy. And since we're in Poland, I think it's important to say so. Poland was partitioned and lost its land in 1795. ending its existence as an independent state until the end of World War I, briefly, when it regained independence. And then, obviously, it was occupied and lost its territory during the Second War as well. So 1939, back to a people without a country, no political independence. That independence was regained in 1989, which leads us to present day. What's the connective tissue? They lost their independence. They were carved up by imperial states, but they still had each other. They still had an ethnos. They still had an identity. And that's what Poland is today. And that identity still exists across Europe, and it's getting stronger and stronger and stronger. And it is that identity and the political representation of that identity that will create this reorganization, and eventually, I think, will reset the migration policies in these nations. How difficult it will be to get there, that's the tricky part. How long will that take? I don't know if it will take as long as people think, but I think the collateral damage will be significant because the negligence, the corruption at the governmental level has done irreparable damage in some sense to the political structure of these countries. So that's going to take some time to repair. But the awareness is there, the energy at the street level, the frustration with government, that's beginning to produce real organization. And I think people increasingly know that the solution is remigration. And that is also, I think, in the best interests of a lot of the folks that are living here from the Middle East or other parts of the world. They really want to be in their own countries as well. So I think that's where we're headed. I just think the journey to get there is going to be tricky. It's going to be tough.
So I can sum up this that I'm here in OSCE events for 2018, and I can say this kind of events, not political correct, are not so often. But so I think that in international organization, this kind of topics on the side events. But I can see also in with the directors with some topics are emerging for many years after the pandemic, and now there is some shift. So I think that institutions are changing. Like OSCE and the governments are changing because of the push from the ground, grassroots NGOs, not gongos. We are not gongos. So we are pushing, and we are the change. I think so, and I think this side event also with your attendance is a part of this. This small change that it's gonna more and more gain speed. I think in the close future. So thank you all for coming here. And have a good last day or 2 days on OSCE conference. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.